Okay, so have you ever felt it? That feeling like the underlying currents of the world are shifting.
Hmm.
And it's just genuinely hard to keep up sometimes. Like the ground beneath our feet, financially, politically.
Socially, yeah.
Exactly. It feels like it's subtly but, powerfully changing.
Definitely feels that way.
Well, today we're going on a deep dive
Right.
into three sort of interconnected forces that are reshaping, well, pretty much everything. Global power, finance.
And even our own deepest beliefs.
For this deep dive, we've gathered insights from quite a range of sources.
Yeah, we've got a JP Morgan report looking at de-dollarization. There's a New York Life investments analysis on geopolitical risk in a shifting world order.
And then we're taking a bit of a detour, which I think is fascinating.
Absolutely, into academic research on the social consequences of conspiracy theories.
And even a pretty lively Reddit thread about the role of secret societies in the world of power.
It's quite a mix.
It is. And our mission here is really to unpack what these big shifts truly mean.
Yeah, find some maybe surprising facts and help you understand the broader implications.
For the global landscape, sure, but also for your own sort of daily experience.
Okay, let's get into it.
It's time to truly unpack this. And we're starting with the big money, right? The dollar.
Right. For decades, I mean, the U.S. dollar has been the world's reserve currency. It's the backbone of global trade, global finance.
We all kind of take it for granted.
Exactly. But our sources, especially that JP Morgan report, they suggest this whole era might be entering what they call a regime change.
Regime change. That sounds serious.
It implies that the traditional power structures are, well, fracturing.
Okay, so when we talk about de-dollarization, which is the term they use, what does that actually mean in, like, practical terms?
So the JP Morgan report, it defines de-dollarization pretty clearly. It's a significant reduction in how much the US dollar is used in world trade and financial transactions.
A significant reduction.
Yep.
And are we seeing, tangible signs of that happening already?
We are definitely seeing early signals, yeah. Take commodities, for instance.
Okay.
Energy transactions are increasingly being priced in currencies other than the US dollar.
Like what?
Well, a key example is Russian oil products. They're now being sold to buyers in the East and South using local currencies, or maybe currencies of nations they consider friendly.
Interesting.
Natasha Kaneva, she's JP Morgan's head of global commodity strategy, she points out that, okay, while most oil still sells for dollars,
Right.
Russia's move could genuinely prompt other producers to think about doing the same.
So potential domino effect.
Potentially, yeah. And you see countries like India, China, Turkey actively looking for dollar alternatives.
And it's not just oil, is it? You mentioned payment systems, too.
Exactly. We're seeing new payment systems popping up globally. And these let people do cross-border transactions without involving U.S. banks.
And China's role here is massive.
Oh, huge. China's e-commerce market was, around $5.8 trillion in 2023.
Wow.
Yeah, that's about half the global total. And their digital payments market, expected to grow 10% annually. And it's largely off limits to foreign networks. That creates a whole parallel system.
Okay, so commodities, payment systems.
Yeah,
What about reserves, like the money countries hold?
good point. We can't overlook foreign exchange reserves. The dollar's actual share of those reserves has decreased over the past couple of decades.
Really?
Yeah, especially in emerging markets. Central banks, particularly in these regions, are significantly upping their gold holdings, trying to diversify.
How significant are we talking?
Well, in 2022, central banks collectively bought a net 1,136 tons of gold. That was the highest annual demand on record.
A record. All right.
And then they bought another 1,037 tons in 2023. Kaneva, over at JP Morgan, notes this reduces their need for, precautionary U.S. dollar reserves and U.S. Treasury.
Which frees up money for other things.
Exactly. It frees up capital for their own domestic projects.
Okay, so given all these signs, commodities, payments, reserves, gold buying, it sounds like the dollar's dominance is genuinely on the way out. Or is that too simplistic?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Or maybe the multi-trillion-dollar question.
Right.
Look, while these are definitely clear signs of diversification, Joyce Chang, she's chair of global research at JP Morgan, she really emphasizes that meaningful de-dollarization is, quote, likely to take decades.
Decades. Not exactly imminent then.
Not imminent in terms of a collapse. No, it's a very, very slow ship to turn. And that's mainly because the dollar's dominance is propped up by these incredibly entrenched structural factors.
Like what sort of factors?
Deep and liquid capital markets, for one.
Mm-hmm.
The rule of law, predictable legal systems. A commitment to a free-floating currency regime, meaning its value is set by the market, not fixed by the government.
Stuff that's hard to replicate elsewhere.
Very hard. Plus transparent financial systems for getting hold of USD liquidity when you need it. These things give the dollar a huge structural advantage.
And you mentioned we should be careful about the trade share numbers too.
Yeah, that's important context. While the U.S. is the second largest goods exporter, its share of global trade has been declining. But Chang argues that isn't necessarily de-dollarization itself.
So what is it then?
It reflects other things like cost convergence between countries, like things getting similarly expensive everywhere, and also the fact that economies are becoming more service-based rather than just goods-based.
Okay.
So Chang's bottom line is, quote, overall, the dollar's transactional dominance remains undisputed. For now, at least.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? What's the practical takeaway here?
Well, the effect of this slow-motion de-dollarization on U.S. growth is, frankly, uncertain.
Okay.
It could negatively impact U.S. stocks, equities, and returns. It could potentially lead to upward pressure on real yields, that's your investment return, after you account for inflation.
Right.
And while maybe a structurally weaker dollar could make U.S. exports more competitive, it might also directly lower foreign investment coming into the U.S. economy.
And inflation.
There's potential for inflationary pressure too, yeah, because import costs could rise. Though the benchmark estimates suggest these effects might actually be relatively small, at least in the medium term.
So the key isn't some sudden collapse.
No, not according to these sources. It's more like a slow rebalancing of economic leverage. It suggests that the kind of stability we've maybe taken for granted might gradually evolve.
This is something less predictable.
Potentially, yeah. A landscape where the cost of living, investment returns, they become a bit less predictable. But we're talking over decades, not next year.
Okay. And as these financial currents shift, they obviously ripple outwards, don't they? They start redefining the whole global stage.
Exactly. Which brings us neatly to geopolitics.
Yeah, because the New York Life Investments Report argues that geopolitical events aren't just temporary blips anymore.
Right. They're now driving long-term economic and market realignments. They stress that investors, really anyone paying attention, can no longer treat geopolitical risk as episodic, like something that flares up and goes away.
It demands constant attention now.
Consistent consideration, yeah. It's not just background noise anymore. They argue it's becoming a fundamental driver.
And the report talks about the global economic order fracturing.
It does. The order that was, heavily shaped by U.S. power for a long time, it's now fracturing. We're moving towards a new era of strategic rivalry.
Driven by what?
Things like trade friction, you see that everywhere. Concerns about supply chain vulnerabilities, we all felt that recently. And this rise of economic nationalism.
Which is basically countries looking out for number one.
Kind of, yeah. A focus on prioritizing domestic industries, domestic jobs, often at the expense of that older idea of smooth global integration. It creates a much more fragmented landscape.
It's interesting how the report frames U.S. control historically owning the plumbing of the system.
Yeah, I thought that was a great analogy. The plumbing of the global financial and information system.
How so?
Through things like control of SWIFT access that messaging system banks use and dollar clearing, which is basically how dollar transactions get finalized globally.
Okay.
Then there's the dollar's huge role as the dominant reserve currency, still around 60% of the total.
Right.
And, maybe less obviously, the U.S. Navy securing global sea lanes, which has been crucial for energy security for decades.
But the report says these areas, this plumbing, are now becoming battlegrounds.
Exactly. These domains are now becoming front lines of strategic competition. They're potential areas of geopolitical disruption.
Like how?
We're seeing risks like SWIFT alternatives.
Yeah.
China's CIPS system is one example, starting to gain traction.
CIPS.
Yeah, cross-border interbank payment system. And things like sanctions are pushing rival blocs, groups of countries to develop their own parallel payment systems, trying to bypass that U.S.-controlled plumbing.
This leads to a really crucial distinction the New York Life Investments Report makes, doesn't it? The difference between a geopolitical event and a paradigm shift.
Yes, this is key. What does that distinction actually look like in the real world?
So what's an event? Something temporary.
Right. A geopolitical event is a disruption, but it's temporary and it's contained. The basic status quo largely holds afterwards.
Can you give an example?
Sure, think about Iraq's invasion of Kuwait back in 1990. Big deal at the time.
Huge. Oil prices spiked.
They did. But then they retraced. And the broader narrative of globalization, that idea of an ever more interconnected world, it pretty much remained intact. That was an event.
Okay. Any others?
Another example they give is the U.S.-China currency dispute in the early 2000s.
Right. Lots of heated talk.
Exactly. Heated rhetoric, political posturing, but ultimately, trade continued to expand between the two, and the basic setup, the status quo, held. That was also an event.
Okay, so if those were just events, what makes something a true paradigm shift, something that fundamentally rewrites the rules?
Good question. A paradigm shift, in contrast, is a structural turn. It fundamentally reworks global systems and leads to enduring, long-lasting change.
Like the Arab Spring.
The Arab Spring in 2011 is a really clear example, yeah. That wave of uprisings didn't just cause temporary disruption. It shattered regional stability in a lasting way.
Right.
It disrupted oil production, sure, but more fundamentally, it accelerated a long-term shift in Western energy policy, a move away from relying so heavily on Middle East oil towards diversification and self-sufficiency.
Like U.S. shale production kicking off.
Exactly. That was partly a consequence. And another paradigm shift example, the U.S.-China trade war that started around 2018.
Why was that different?
Because it broke with decades of globalization orthodoxy, that belief in ever freer trade. It marked a real structural turn towards decoupling, towards separating economies.
We're seeing actual supply chains diversifying now because of it.
We are. It fundamentally changed how countries and companies approached global trade and sourcing. That's a paradigm shift.
So why should you, listening right now, care about this distinction? Event versus paradigm shift.
Well, understanding whether a geopolitical incident is just a temporary event or part of a deeper paradigm shift is actually crucial.
Why?
Because it helps you comprehend the long-term economic and market realignments that are underway. And those affect everything from your investment strategies to the prices of goods you buy every day.
So it helps you respond strategically, not just react to the latest headline.
Precisely. It informs how you navigate these choppy waters.
It's really fascinating how these huge macro shifts in power, financial, geopolitical, can actually ripple down and influence our individual perceptions and beliefs.
It really is. And as the world order shifts around us, it seems our perceptions of who's actually in control also shift.
Which brings us to our next area, the human element. Trust, beliefs, hidden power.
Yeah, and the academic research we looked at points to something quite stark, a rising popularity and persistence of conspiracy theories.
How stark are we talking?
Well, check this out. A 1963 survey showed 29% of people believe the official account of the JFK assassination. Okay?
About a third.
But by 2001, only 13% did.
Wow, that's a massive drop.
It's a huge erosion in public trust in official narratives over time.
And what's really alarming here, according to the research, is that just being exposed to information supporting conspiracy theories has real-world consequences. It's not just abstract belief.
Absolutely not. The research found it reduces people's intentions to actually engage in politics.
Why?
It seems to be mediated by feelings of political powerlessness, that underlying belief that your actions, your vote, your participation won't really have any impact anyway.
So it makes people check out politically.
It seems to correlate with that, yes. And it also, interestingly, reduces intentions to engage in pro-environmental behaviors.
Like recycling or using public transport.
Exactly. Things like buying energy-efficient light bulbs or using public transport. And again, this seems to be mediated by specific feelings.
Yeah.
Feelings of climate powerlessness, like the problem's too big, nothing I do matters. Also increased uncertainty about whether climate change is even a real problem. And crucially, disillusionment with climate change scientists themselves.
But interestingly, the research didn't find it necessarily increased general mistrust across the board.
That's right. It seemed quite targeted in its effects, reducing willingness to act on politics and climate specifically, not necessarily making people distrust everything more.
Which is a subtle but important distinction.
It is. And the alarming insight here isn't just about what people believe. It's that this rise in conspiracy thinking might represent a profound, subtle erosion of our collective ability to act.
Disempowering us from tackling big global challenges.
Right, when we arguably need more engagement, not less.
And here's another really intriguing finding from that research. People seem inclined to believe even contradictory conspiracy theories.
Yeah, that's wild, isn't it?
As long as they both support the general idea of an overarching cover-up.
Exactly. That desire for a single hidden explanation that someone powerful is pulling the strings behind the scenes can apparently override logical inconsistencies between different theories.
Which leads us perfectly into that Reddit thread we looked at.
Right, the one asking whether secret societies truly hold power today.
What was the general feeling there? Are the Illuminati running things?
Huh. Well, the consensus on the thread actually pointed away from the formal cloak and dagger groups like, the Freemasons or the Illuminati. The feeling was they hold relatively little real power today.
So who does, according to the discussion?
Instead, the thread suggested that tremendous power is actually wielded by more modern, private, exclusive groups. Think less ancient rituals, more like business associates, politicians with similar interests, meeting and coordinating privately where their dealings aren't open to public scrutiny.
Someone mentioned a WhatsApp hedge fund manager group chat as a sort of modern equivalent.
Exactly. Less about secret handshakes, maybe more about encrypted messages, which, let's be honest, can feel just as impenetrable sometimes.
Or thinking about more formal, but still exclusive influential organizations.
Right, like the Federalist Society in the U.S., which has had a huge impact on judicial appointments.
Or, to use a UK example that came up in the thread, the historical influence of groups like the Bullingdon Club at Oxford on future prime ministers.
Yeah. The key point the discussion raised is that secrecy and camouflage aren't necessarily signs of weakness. They're fundamentally a function of power.
How so?
It's about controlling information, controlling access. That classic line, sorry, pal, need to know basis, and I'm the one who decides if you need to know.
Right, control.
And beyond those traditional definitions, some people on the thread argue that today maybe big tech companies function a bit like secret societies.
In what sense?
Given their exclusivity, their immense political and economic power, and their routine use of things like non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, to enforce secrecy internally and externally.
And the Epstein case came up too, didn't it? As an example of how missing evidence fuels suspicion.
It did, specifically the missing evidence, like crucial CCTV footage. For some, that absence of evidence isn't just a gap. It's interpreted as proof of a high-level cover-up.
Suggesting a powerful clandestine network was at play, capable of making evidence disappear.
Precisely.
Huh.
Whether true or not, it feeds that perception of hidden power.
So this really poses a crucial question for all of us, for you listening. In this world where the old power structures seem to be shifting,
Yeah.
and information is everywhere, but often contradictory or unreliable, how do these perceptions of hidden control, of secret deals and unseen forces, actually impact our willingness to engage with critical issues, like politics, like climate change?
It's a deep connection, isn't it, between the huge global shifts and our very individual choices and feelings of agency.
Definitely. So we've talked about the shifting sands of financial power, the changing dynamics of geopolitics, and this human element of trust, belief, and hidden power.
Yeah, quite a journey already.
Now, let's try to connect all these threads by looking at the actual architecture of global governance itself. How is that changing?
Okay. And the human development reports we consulted really highlight something crucial here. The rise of the global south developing countries is fundamentally transforming global governance.
Wow.
It's creating new demands on the existing multilateral institutions, the big global bodies, and it's also jumpstarting regionalism countries grouping together more regionally.
What's surprising, though, is that many of these key global institutions we still rely on.
Like the IMF, the UN Security Council, the World Health Organization, the UNHCR for refugees.
Right. They are mostly created after World War II.
Decades ago, to address the specific needs and power balances of that era.
And the reports say they're now outdated, anachronistic.
Pretty much, yeah. But despite that, there's been almost no significant formal institutional reform to really update them for the 21st century. They're stuck.
So what happens instead? Do countries just give up?
Not exactly. What seems to be happening is this phenomenon the Swiss call forum shopping.
Forum shopping, like browsing for the best deal.
Kind of. Instead of banging their heads against the wall trying to reform the old, often deadlocked global structures, states are creating new bodies.
Especially regional ones.
Especially regional organizations, yeah. Or specialized groups. So now, states have options. They can shop around and pick the forum, the group, the organization that seems best suited to pursue their specific interests at that moment.
Can you give an example of this forum shopping in action?
Sure, look at finance. Developing countries are adopting what the report calls mixed strategies.
Okay.
They're building up their own foreign exchange reserves, kind of like self-insurance against shocks, so they don't have to rely solely on the IMF.
Right.
They're using more bilateral credit lines deals
Yep.
between just two countries, and they're reinforcing these regional arrangements.
Like the Air Monetary Fund.
Yeah, their monetary fund, which has about $2.7 billion, and there's the Latin American Reserve Fund, FLAR, with around $2.34 billion.
And what's notable about FLAR?
What's really interesting is that FLAR, unlike the AMF or often the IMF, does not require countries borrowing from it to also have an IMF program in place.
So it's offering a more independent regional solution, breaking away from IMF conditions.
Exactly. It showcases that push for more autonomy.
What about in global security? Is it fragmenting there too?
Oh, definitely. Global security cooperation is in a real state of flux. You often hear emerging powers criticizing international efforts as being too Western-centric, reflecting Western priorities.
And the other side.
Well, Western powers sometimes accuse emerging powers of being obstructionist or, not part of the solution when they don't agree.
And the UN Security Council is the prime example of deadlock.
Absolutely. Attempts to reform it, like expanding the number of permanent members, have gone nowhere. There isn't even agreement among the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, on how it should be expanded. Total deadlock.
Even on supposedly universal ideas.
Even on things like the responsibility to protect. That idea that the international community has a duty to intervene to prevent mass atrocities.
Which sounds good in principle.
In principle, yes. But in practice, there are deep political divisions over how and when it should be applied. China, for example, has actively worked to weaken its scope and limit interventions. Shows deep disagreement on fundamental norms.
Okay, let's touch on global health. We have big initiatives there.
We do, like the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB and Malaria, GFPM. Huge impact.
What?
But emerging economies are increasingly being called upon to shoulder more of the financial burden for these global goods.
And are they?
It's mixed. The report points to Brazil, for example. Despite its large economy, it received $45 million in GFPM grants over a period, but only contributed $200,000 back.
Quite a discrepancy.
It highlights a historical pattern. The G8 group of established economies traditionally drove global health financing. The broader G20 group hasn't really tackled global health in the same significant way yet. Different priorities, maybe?
And migration. Another area of division.
Stark division, actually. Countries have distinctly different priorities here, often splitting along north-south lines.
How so?
Generally, migrant-sending states, often in the global south, tend to push for multilateralism. They want binding international rules to protect migrant rights and regulate labor markets.
Whereas migrant-receiving states?
Often in the global north, they tend to prefer preserving their own sovereign authority over immigration policies. They want control over their borders.
And this division is obvious.
Very obvious. The report mentions a 2006 UN General Assembly vote about creating a global migration forum. The vote split almost entirely along those north-south lines. Shows how deep the divergence is.
So the overall picture emerging here is, what, a messy landscape?
Pretty much. The global governance system seems to be transforming into this really complex patchwork almost, an array of fragmented institutions.
Operating at different levels.
Yeah, bilateral deals between two countries, regional blocs, interregional cooperation, plus all these informal networks flourishing underneath the formal structures.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, depends who you ask. Some see this fragmentation quite negatively.
Why?
They worry it risks excluding weaker states, leads to duplication of effort, and ultimately jeopardizes the whole idea of a universal, global, multilateral order.
Yeah.
Makes tackling truly global problems harder.
But there's another view.
Others see it more positively, or at least pragmatically. They argue these smaller, more flexible club goods groupings, where benefits are shared mainly by members, can actually enable faster, more efficient cooperation.
Because they bypass the gridlock.
Exactly. They bypass the polarization and deadlock you often see in the big universal multilateral forums like the UN. So maybe it's inefficient, but it's how things get done now.
Which leads to a really important question for you, our listener, to consider.
Yeah.
As global challenges, climate change, pandemics, economic instability, as these challenges grow, how will this complex, fragmented, kind of pluralist system of governance actually respond?
Can it cope?
Yeah, can it cope? And what impact will this fragmentation have on overall international stability and cooperation down the line? It's a huge question.
It really is. Wow, we've covered a lot of ground today.
We really have. It's been quite the journey, hasn't it? From those quiet shifts in global finance
Yeah, the de-dollarization debate.
to the really dramatic dynamics of geopolitical power, the events versus paradigm shifts.
Right, and then diving into the deeply personal impacts of things like conspiracy theories, perceptions of powerlessness.
And that whole elusive nature of secret power in the modern world.
It all connects, though, doesn't it?
I think so. What seems to connect all these different threads is this profound transformation happening in how power is actually exercised, how it's perceived by people, and maybe how it's resisted in our increasingly interconnected yet fragmented world.
Yeah. The sources we looked at, especially J.P. Morgan, they strongly suggest we are in a period of genuine regime change.
Moving away from that clearer, perhaps simpler, U.S.-led global order.
Towards something much more fragmented, much more contested, more multipolar.
So maybe a final thought to leave everyone with, something to mull over.
Okay.
What might be the long-term consequences for global stability, for cooperation on those big challenges we mentioned?
Yeah.
If the powerful actors in the world, whether they're states or influential individuals or groups, if they continue to prioritize these informal networks, these bilateral deals, these exclusive clubs.
Over strengthening the formal multilateral institutions that are supposed to be for everyone.
Exactly. What happens if that trend continues? Is fragmentation the future?
That is definitely something to think about.
Something to mull over until our next deep dive.